Hi, this is Scott Bradfield, and this is Reading Great Books in the Bathtub, episode 42 or 43. I can't believe how many episodes there are now. And every time I think about 42 episodes, I think we're all going to die. It's just time just goes flashing by. Today, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite bathtub writers. We talked a few weeks ago, we talked about Brian Moore, who I think I'm giving the number one best all-time bathtub reading award because you can count on every novel you read by Brian Moore, even if you read it before, if you reread it. Every Brian Moore novel is just good and absorbing and intelligent, and it's a fun to read his stuff, and the time kind of flashes by. My second favorite, my second or third favorite, I probably have to put Richard Yates in here. Favorite bathtub reading is William Trevor. William Trevor is an Irish short story writer. I'm not trying to be reverse nationalistic and just give the Irish all these kudos, but he's from County Cork. Brian Moore was from Belfast, and it was a transplanted Northern Ireland Irish person. And William Trevor was born in Ireland, but he traveled around a lot. And you can sort of tell from his work because Trevor, like Moore, can write about every nationality. Trevor does. He'll do Americans, British, rural country people in England, rural country people in Ireland, Italians. He'll do people on holiday, Germans, and he does them all with a sense you're in their skin when you read the stories. You never think, oh, this is an Irish person pretending he's writing about an Italian, say. He's just always convincing. Every age, every type of person. The thing I think of when what distinguishes William Trevor to me as a writer and a reader, is that most of the writers I like, and I think this is true of myself, can do certain characters well. And they might occasionally do some odd characters here and there, but there's a certain area they're comfortable with, and the types of people they write about, whether they're middle class or men or women or people from America. Trevor can do anybody. He'll do working class guys doing the re-roofing your cottage. He'll do driving instructors. He'll do autistic art restorers. He'll do an old prostitute who picks up some guy in a bar. He gets in everybody's skin, and he's very comfortable with them. And he's not cruel, and he's not judgmental about anybody. And no one seems better than anybody else. And he just, in one book, there's no two characters that are even similar in my mind. He does women very well, particularly older people late in his life, but you never quite know where his stories are going to go or who's going to be in them. So much so that I just read this book a few weeks ago, and I reviewed this for the LA Times. I'm going to post links to the two pieces I did for the Los Angeles Times below this talk. And I forget a lot of the stories, even though they really hit me when I read them. So what I thought I would do when I was writing that last review is I read Trevor's last stories in conjunction with his first book of stories. This is his first individual volume. It's called The Day We Got Drunk on Cake. It's from roughly 1967, so it's stories in the 60s. Trevor started off as a sculptor. And I believe he did a lot of teaching, particularly in secondary schools. And he does kids really well. He does school. There's people who work in schools well. And this first book of stories came out after a novel or two. What happens with the individual novels of short stories, and by short story writers, is they often get lost. And this is one that's got lost. This is a great book. It should be read as it was published, as an individual collection of stories by a writer at a certain period in his life who has shaped that book with a beginning, middle, and end. And the ending of this collection is a bango story, really a brilliant story, terrifying story. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about these two books and what's similar and different about them. They're both wonderful, and they both should be read individually and not in this big, fat, collected stories of Trevor that keeps coming out and keeps getting bigger, and because that's not how you read short stories. Short stories are very powerful. They really need to be controlled in a nice narrative package, and Trevor always did that well. Here's his here's basically his main, well, all of his collections besides the first and last one. So he had a pretty productive career over 50 years or so. Most of his books are 250 pages. There's Cheating at Canasta, one of the late ones, a great book of stories. And they're really the best way to read the stories just because they're comfortable as well. This book has kind of gotten lost because it was so early. It sort of got kind of disseminated in all these big collected stories. And it should not be because it's a very different book from his later stories. I'm often saying to my students that when you start off writing, you really want to be aware of the very basic techniques of good story writing. Most of my students don't know anything about them. I don't know what they're thinking about, frankly, when they write stories. And you learn them from good writers. You'll see that most writers are much clearer in their use of technique in their early books. There's a perfect example. So in his first book of stories, Trevor sets up his characters very quickly in the first paragraph. We know who the point of view is very quickly. We know what the situation is very quickly. And then we follow that situation through to the conclusion. There's, for example, the second story in this book is called The General's Day. And this is about some old, I think he's British, I can't remember now. Some old man who was in the military, and once a week a cleaning lady comes, and he has to get out of the house so she can do his cleaning for 2 or 3 hours. And he goes off and annoys people all over the village, usually gets drunk, and then comes home pissed out of his mind and annoys the cleaning lady. Now, if you look at the opening of this paragraph, it starts, General Suffolk pulled on 2 gray knitted socks and stood upright. Now, that's a very typically strong, clear opening sentence for a short story. We know who the point of view is. We know when the story's starting. All the boring stuff I pound my students on all the time. And we know we got a picture of our character who's very upright. He's setting himself up. One sentence gives us a huge amount of information. Well, not information, a lot of narrative stuff. And it starts our story. One sentence. And we know that point of view. Later stories of Trevor are a little more impressionistic. And I think most of my students are often looking at late books or stories that win awards and so forth. And they're not really seeing how these writers develop. And it's not always as clear when you start some of these stories. For example, here's a wonderful story here called At the Cafe Daria. Along a single wall of the Cafe Daria, the scarlet upholstered banquettes haven't changed. The ornate brass footrail at the counter remains. His later stories are a little bit foggier when they start. The point of view is never as clearly established in the later stories. And we often move around from points of view, one point of view to another, almost within paragraphs. But Trevor's very confident. He's very clear. And he has this kind of poetic, nice stroke. And I think of, if you look at a very elaborate period of Picasso, just for an example, if you look at something where Guernica Night, or you look at some of the blue period stuff of the clowns, where you see these lovely details and this clarity of the individual figures. And then you look at some of these later sketches that he does, sometimes on those mirrors, if you watch that old YouTube video, or in the glass, where you do some of those quick sketches that he does. Those lines are quick, but they're establishing all the same things. And there's a sort of foggier beauty to these later stories of Trevor. Okay, so I wanted to say really quickly, so we have the variety of characters in this collection, which is called The Day We Got Drunk on Cake. We also have at least 2 or 3 very macabre horror stories. The closing story in this, called Miss Smith, is one of the scariest stories I've ever read. And we move from, a comic story of this old general running around getting drunk. We have a story called In at the Birth, which is a very macabre Alfred Hitchcock Twilight Zone type story about an old woman who goes to babysit for a couple in the neighborhood. And the couple says, we just want you to sit in the house while we go out. Our lovely child is asleep. Don't go back there. Don't ever go in the room. Just always leave her alone and just wait until we come home. And this old woman does this for several months. And one night, for some reason, she goes back there to look at the baby. And she goes in there and she finds a really old man. These people have been keeping an old man who's pretty much got dementia and are treating him like their baby. And one day he dies. And the couples run into her. They say, we can't use you anymore because our baby died. This old guy died. So they're like funny and horrifying. We have other stories in here, like the introspection of J.F. Powers, which is about a driving instructor, a huge, fat, obese man who was kind of powerful in the military when he was in the military, and then he got overweight, fat, and became a driving instructor. The title story, The Day We Got Drunk on Cake, is hilarious. It's about a guy who just loves lots of women, and he's off on an afternoon boozer lunch thing with some friends, and he keeps calling this girl he's interested in. And every time he calls her, she's with some other man. It's a very funny story. And these stories are really bright, smart, sharp, clear as a bell, sentence by sentence. Whereas this later book, again, his later stuff gets much more melancholy, much softer, and very powerful emotionally. They're very sad stories with humor in them as well. The first story of this book is called The Piano Teacher's Pupil. And I'll give you just an example. It's about a lot of elderly, late middle-aged women, kind of Judith Hearn types, if you know Brian Moore's famous novel, The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn. And she's a piano teacher who spends all day listening to really terrible people, little children, just awful children playing terrible piano. And one day this young kid comes in, and he sits down, he plays something like Brahms or something, and it's beautiful. And she just sits there and just loves it and just enjoys it, has a great time. And at the end of it, she says, thank you, and she tries to teach him something. She shows him some stupid piece of information. And the kid goes off, and she realizes that after he left, he stole something from her house, like a feather, like a pen or an earring or something. And every week he comes over, he plays something beautiful, and she's just loving this kid, and he steals something. It's a great idea. And he pulls the story off. There's so many wonderful stories in here. The one I didn't get a chance to talk about in the review is one of the best stories I've ever read, called An Idol in Winter. And it's about a young girl who lives up in the moors, up in Yorkshire, I think, and a young man is hired to come tutor her. And he comes for a summer, I think, just for a brief period of her life. And they have really nice times together. He's an older boy, but she's a young girl, and she has a kind of slightly fancies him, but they just have nice times. And she always remembers him, and he always remembers her and this nice time they had together. And years later, she's grown up, and he's married and has a child, a daughter of his own, about the same age. And they fall in love, and he moves out to Yorkshire and leaves his wife and daughter behind. It's a really emotionally powerful story, because he goes to this girl and they find each other again, and he's left his family behind, and his feelings for his daughter are just tearing him apart. I won't tell you the story anymore, but it's just a lovely little story about emotions and loving someone and then losing somebody at the same time. And where the story goes, you don't quite expect, but it makes sense when you get there. I think that's all I want to say about these two wonderful books of stories. I would say read them as individual volumes. This is really important with short story writers. Don't get those big fucking doorstopper things. You're not going to ever appreciate what this writer did. And you can start to look at all these different volumes that they put together over their life, over certain periods of their life, and see the story that's developing in that time. There's a shape to those collections. For example, with The Day We Got Drunk on Cake, it concludes with a story called Miss Smith, which is about a kind of pudgy, unattractive, unlikable kid. I think he's 6 or 8 years old, and that a primary school student who has a teacher named Mrs. Smith who makes fun of him all the time. She's kind of saying, "Oh, you poor, silly, foolish kid. Oh, he doesn't know the answers to any questions," and she's always making fun of him. And eventually, she leaves school, and this kid is obsessed with her because she made him feel so bad. And then he actually starts to like her. He has to starts having fascination for her, and eventually, he decides she's not returning this affection. He decides to torment her, and it is one of the most horrifying stories I've ever read. It's funny and terrifying. Miss Smith, any collection of great horror stories would not find a more scary and disturbing story than Miss Smith. And it's funny. And it's beautifully written. So those are two great books. Any one of it, you should read any individual volume of Trevor. Don't get a best of. Any individual volume that he published during his lifetime. And just sit back and you'll have at least 10 or 12 good baths out of it, okay? You'll get out in like 20 minutes. The length are perfect. So you'll be finished in about 20, 25 minutes. You won't be late for work, and you'll have a great time. And it will stay with you all day, each one of these stories. Any story he writes will work. He has never written a bad story. I think I've now read every single book he's ever written. It's the short stories. And his novels are good too. You should read his novels. I've enjoyed. But just the impact of these individual collections are terrific. And they're great bathtub reading. Okay? All right.